I watched the video 3 times. My daughter called me a worthless burden, right there in her designer kitchen, sipping wine in a house I'd quietly paid for over 5 years. She had no idea I owned the mortgage or that her next payment would bounce. And when it did, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply poured a cup of tea and let the truth do the talking. It was 11:42 p.m. when my phone buzzed beside the antique lamp in my reading nook. I'd just closed a battered copy of The House of Mirth, the spine worn thin from years of rereads, and was cradling a lukewarm mug of chamomile. The world was quiet, the kind of deep velvet quiet that only settles over Santa Fe in the late hours, when even the coyotes have gone still and the desert seems to hold its breath. I didn't expect a message, not at that hour, not from Jacob. "Grandma, you need to see this. I'm sorry." That was all it said. 7 words, but something in them made my chest tighten. Not fear exactly, a kind of foreboding, the kind of instinct a mother never loses, even when her children stop needing it. I tapped the link he'd sent. The screen filled with light in the darkness. It was a video. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button, and then I pressed it. Celeste's voice came first, sharp, familiar, and soaked in something sour. "Honestly, Mom's a worthless burden. All that fuss over her stupid books and independence, and she barely contributes. We're the ones keeping her going." I froze. The room seemed to darken, though the lamp still glowed. Celeste was sitting at the head of her granite kitchen island, stemless wine glass in hand. Blonde hair swept up like she always wore it when she wanted to look casual but curated. Her husband Brian was beside her, nodding with that smug half-smile he used when he thought he sounded intelligent. "She owes us," he said. "After all, she lives off our help." In the background, Mira, my granddaughter, once so tender with me, barely lifted her eyes from her phone. But when Celeste sneered something about Mom's dramatics and her little library life, Mira laughed. They didn't know Jacob had recorded them. Or maybe they forgot he was even there. That's the thing about people who see you as furniture. They stop noticing when you walk into a room. I didn't cry. Not yet. My hands didn't shake either. Instead, I watched it twice, then a third time. Somewhere in the background, a pot boiled on their stove. Laughter echoed over the clink of glasses, and in the silence of my little house, with my books and my cat and my dead husband's portrait over the fireplace, something shifted. Not broke, not snapped, shifted because they had no idea that the woman they called a burden was the reason their house still stood. No idea that I'd spent 5 years quietly paying off their mortgage through the Blue Haven Trust my Walter and I had built together. They didn't know they were sitting in a home I'd saved. I reached for my tea, took a slow sip, and let the bitterness of the chamomile settle on my tongue. They'd called me a burden. They were about to learn what it really meant to carry something. And just like that, I pressed pause on the video, turned off the lamp, and opened the drawer beside me, where all the trust papers were still neatly filed. Walter always believed in quiet preparation. He never liked fanfare, not even when he retired after 39 years as a civil engineer, still sharp as ever and still folding his undershirts with military precision. "Prepare in peace for the storms that come," he used to say, as if life was weather and we were only ever guests in it. When he passed, everything felt unfinished, except the paperwork. That man had left nothing to chance. The pension was in order. The savings account balanced to the penny. The life insurance, well, it was more than anyone expected, enough to make most people feel safe. But Walter didn't want safety. He wanted legacy. He once told me, months before the cancer took his voice, "Lillian, I may not be able to give you the world, but I'll make sure you don't have to ask for anything you've already earned." So after the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the calls slowed to polite check-ins, I did exactly what Walter would have done. I built something. The Blue Haven Trust. It wasn't a grand name, just the name of the cabin he built with his own 2 hands down in Rockport by the water. We spent our 37th anniversary staining that porch in silence, each stroke of the brush saying more than words could. It was his haven. Our haven. I never told Celeste about the trust. I didn't tell anyone but my financial advisor, Farah, a brilliant woman with a mind like a steel trap and a heart soft enough to offer me tissues during every tax season. I asked her to set it up so it was anonymous, completely blind. I didn't want Celeste or Brian to know I was involved. I didn't want them to feel embarrassed. Or maybe deep down, I didn't want to see how ungrateful they might become if they knew. 5 years ago, Celeste came to me crying, though in hindsight, they were tears of inconvenience, not heartbreak. Brian's job had dried up after some speculative investment nonsense, and Celeste's interior design clients had all but vanished during the slow season. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage. The bank was circling. Foreclosure was days away. I remember her voice on the phone that night, tight, clipped, pretending to be calm. "Mom, we're just in a tough patch. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought, maybe if you know someone in finance." I could have wired her the money directly, but I knew Brian's pride wouldn't allow it. And honestly, I'd already seen the way he looked at me like I was some doddering figurehead in our family, a living relic, tolerated at holidays and discussed like a budget item. So I called Farah, told her to step in as a silent intermediary. We created a mechanism through the Blue Haven Trust. The trust would acquire the remainder of their mortgage from the lender and continue to process the payments directly through their bank, under a generic account name that wouldn't raise questions. Every month for 5 years, I quietly deposited a little over $3,000 to cover the difference between their minimum payments and the actual mortgage. It added up, over $190,000, money that could have gone toward travel or home renovations, or even just sitting in a comfortable nest egg for emergencies. But I never thought of it as a burden. Not then. It felt like love in action, like what Walter would have wanted. Celeste never once asked who had helped them stay afloat. She never tried to track the details. She just moved forward, renovating kitchens, booking vacations, giving Mira a car for her 17th birthday, while telling people they'd weathered the storm through hard work and perseverance. And I never asked for thanks. Just once, maybe a note, a gesture, a sign that they felt lucky to have someone watching out for them. But no. Instead, they sat in that video with their whine and their laughter and their accusations. And all I could think was, they never even thought to ask where the help came from. They just assumed it wasn't me. Because in their eyes, I was no longer capable, no longer useful, just a quiet old woman with a shelf full of novels and a pension. They forgot that libraries are full of knowledge people underestimate. And they forgot that I, Lillian Marlowe, built my life on remembering every single detail. It's strange, isn't it? How clearly you can see the pattern once the thread finally snaps. After watching that video, after sitting in silence and remembering how much of myself I'd poured into them, I started seeing it everywhere. Little signs, little wounds I'd brushed off or rationalized over the years. Because love makes you do that. It makes you explain things away to protect the image of the people you raised. I started remembering birthdays where I sat alone with a store-bought cupcake because Mira had finals and Celeste got caught up with work. I remembered the vacations they never invited me on, even after I helped them stabilize their finances. Photos on social media of them in Aspen, in Cabo, in Barcelona, Mira grinning in a new coat, Brian holding cocktails poolside. And there I was, liking the posts, leaving comments with hearts and looks amazing, while eating leftover soup on my couch. They never responded, not once. It wasn't just distance, it was erasure. They stopped seeing me as a person with preferences, feelings, memories. I was reduced to the things I could offer, or refuse. And when I refused, the mask would slip. "You're not really using that cabin, Mom. Don't you think you're too old to manage property on your own? It's not like you need money anymore. You live pretty simply." They always said it with a laugh, a light tone, as if they were doing me a favor by gently suggesting I hand over the parts of my life still mine. Celeste had a habit. She'd pat my hand after saying something cruel, like the softness of touch would make the barb less sharp. Once, when I declined to fund Mira's second semester abroad because I was helping the local library repair its roof, Celeste said, "That's sweet, Mom. I just worry you're not thinking strategically about your legacy." Legacy, as if I were a foundation, as if my life boiled down to financial optimization. They never invited me to Mira's high school graduation dinner. I found out about it on Facebook 2 days later. I'd bought her a sapphire necklace, the same one Walter gave me when we first visited Santa Fe. She never thanked me. I asked if she received it. She texted back, "Yeah, thanks. Cute, cute." I still remember the feel of that velvet box in my palm. I dusted it off, polished the chain, even printed out a little note with a quote from Emily Dickinson, Mira's favorite poet when she was 11. She used to curl up on my lap and ask me to read her poems before bed. She used to say I smelled like cinnamon and paper. Now she laughs in the background while her mother calls me a burden. That night, after watching the video, I wandered through my house, touching things like they were evidence, reminders that I'd once been someone more than convenient. The framed letter from the library board thanking me for 30 years of service, the hand-sewn quilt from my reading group, the little ceramic tea set from Mira when she was 9, the one with the chipped blue flower on the saucer. I kept it, always. And in the quiet, I remembered every time they made me feel like that kind of love didn't matter anymore. That unless it was money, it wasn't worth mentioning. I remembered the jokes, small, cruel jokes. Let's not ask Mom to come. She always wants to eat at those boring old cafes. If she brings up another dead author, I swear I'll scream. Mom thinks a pension makes her a financial guru. It's adorable. I had taken it, swallowed it, believed that silence was grace, that not reacting meant I was being the bigger person. But now I understood. My silence had trained them. My generosity had licensed their greed. I had handed them the shape of their entitlement with my own 2 hands. They mistook my humility for helplessness, my kindness for currency. And Mira, my sweet Mira, had started nodding along. She once asked me if the moon was a library for stars. I wrote that down in a notebook because it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard from a child. Now, she sat beside her parents and smiled while they dissected me like a bill to be paid off. That night, I didn't cry. I cataloged. I wrote down everything I remembered. Each instance, each comment, each withdrawal from the emotional account they never repaid, because I was done writing checks with no receipts. And I was done being the silent chapter in their very loud story. The next morning, the doorbell rang just after 10, not the impatient buzz of a delivery driver or the forced chirp of a neighbor needing a favor. This was softer, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door and there he was, Jacob, my grandson, the one bright thread still woven tightly into the fabric of my life. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a few months since we last had tea in the backyard. His face, usually so open and warm, was tight with guilt, his eyes rimmed red like he hadn't slept. "Hi, Grandma," he said quietly. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word, already feeling the shift in the air. The kettle was already warm from my second morning cup, so I poured us both some chamomile and led him to the sunroom. The same room where Walter used to read the paper with the windows open, where Mira once built pillow forts at my feet. Jacob didn't touch his tea. "I shouldn't have sent it like that," he began, voice cracking. I didn't know what else to do." I waited. "Sometimes silence is the kindest invitation to speak. They've been saying stuff for months," he continued. "Little comments, digs about how you act like you still run things, jokes about the cabin, about your memory. They think you're slipping." His voice broke on that last word. "And I kept quiet," he said, "because I thought it would blow over. But last night, when Mom said those things and Mira laughed, I couldn't anymore. I'm sorry." I reached over and took his hand, still large and warm, calloused from studio work and part-time shifts at the hardware store. A builder's hand. Walter would have liked that. "You did the right thing," I said simply. He looked up, surprised. Maybe he expected me to be angry. Maybe he thought I'd scold him for betraying family. But betrayal, I was learning, came in many forms, and truth was not one of them. "They don't know," I said quietly. "About the trust, about the mortgage." His brow furrowed. "What trust?" So I told him. "About the Blue Haven Trust. About the $190,000 I'd contributed to keep his parents in that house. About the payments structured to protect their pride. About how I'd kept receipts for every transaction, every wire, every tax filing. Because Walter always said, "Document first, explain later." Jacob sat back, stunned. "They think they own that house," he whispered. "They do, but only until they don't," I replied. "The deed is held in conditional terms through the trust, and the moment I sense exploitation or abuse, the house reverts to full trust control." I saw something shift in Jacob then, something fierce, protective. The boy who used to water my garden and recite Emily Dickinson under the plum tree was gone. In his place was a man who understood what it meant to draw a line in the sand. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. I got up, crossed to the hallway closet, and pulled out the dusty blue accordion folder where I'd kept every scrap of documentation from the trust. Deed transfers, mortgage offsets, monthly ledger summaries from Farah. Even copies of the original letter Walter and I had drafted for the trust's terms, tucked away behind old birthday cards and my voter registration. I spread the papers across the coffee table like puzzle pieces. "I'm going to prepare," I said. "They're planning something. I don't know the details yet, but I can feel it." "The dinner invite came this morning." Jacob stiffened. "They said it's just to talk. Reconnect. And you believe that?" "No," he said, eyes hardening. "Not anymore." I picked up a notepad and began jotting down items I needed from the lockbox, records I wanted Farah to double-check, and the clause number from the trust, Section 9.4. In the event of undue influence, fraud, or hostile intent by a beneficiary, the asset shall revert to sole trust control. Jacob leaned over to read it with me. "Smart," he murmured. "Did you always plan for this?" "No," I said, "but Walter did." He gave a small, sad smile. Grandpa was always 3 steps ahead. I nodded, and then I looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Jacob, this won't be easy. They'll be angry. You may lose something too." He nodded. "I already have. I lost respect for them a long time ago. I just didn't want to believe it." I squeezed his hand. "Thank you for telling me the truth, for not letting me walk into that house blind." "I'll stand by you, Grandma," he said, "whatever happens." As the sun poured through the windows, catching the edges of our scattered documents and lighting up the grain in the old wood table, I felt something inside me begin to calcify, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I'd lived a life of soft giving, of quiet accommodation, of compromise. But now I would live with eyes open, with spine straight. They had called me a burden. I would show them what it meant to carry weight, and what it looked like when I set it down. The invitation arrived that same afternoon, as though the universe wanted to see what I'd do with it. Celeste's message was breezy, sweetened with emojis and too many exclamation points. "Hey, Mom, we're doing a little family dinner this Sunday. Just us, cozy, fun. Hope you can come. We've been talking and we just miss you so much. 5:30, okay? Love you." It read like a Hallmark card written by a woman who hadn't rolled her eyes at me 2 weeks earlier for offering to bring homemade cobbler to Mira's birthday party. Jacob had warned me it was coming. He said they were calling it an important conversation. Said he'd overheard Brian talking about some next step and getting her to finally let go of that cabin. They were plotting, and they didn't even bother to hide it well. "Still," I replied just as sweetly, "Of course, dear. I'll bring my potato gratin. Looking forward to it." I arrived 5 minutes early, I always do, raised with the kind of manners that teach you to show up before the clock strikes. I wore my best cardigan, the lilac one Walter bought me in Santa Fe before our 25th anniversary dinner, and brought the dish wrapped in a tea towel Mira had once painted for me in 2nd grade. The house looked pristine, as always. The white shutters, the flower beds just slightly too perfect. Celeste greeted me at the door with her usual perfume-heavy hug and a performative squeal. "Mom, you look so good." She hadn't noticed I wore the same cardigan the last 3 times I visited. Inside, the table was already set, cloth napkins, polished silverware, wine breathing in a decanter like it was preparing for a sermon. Brian emerged from the kitchen with an apron on, wiping his hands as if he'd cooked more than just plating takeout onto porcelain. "Lillian," he said with that forced cheerfulness, "you're just in time." Mira appeared next, her phone already in hand, her eyes flicking up just long enough to give me a quick smile that didn't reach her cheeks. "Grandma," she said. "Hey." The small talk flowed like bad coffee, too warm, too bitter. They asked about my book club, my garden, whether I'd been keeping up with the news. I played my part perfectly, smiling, nodding, offering just enough without volunteering too much. But it was all a prelude, a lull before the ask, and I could feel it coming. Dinner was a tight-lipped ballet, conversation choreographed to stay in safe waters. Brian offered seconds with overzealous insistence. Mira cleared plates too quickly. Celeste leaned in often, her voice laced with practiced concern. Then, with coffee barely poured and dessert untouched, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Mom," she began, voice soft, "we've been talking, and we think it's time we discuss some practical things." I met her gaze calmly. "Such as?" "Well," she hesitated, glancing at Brian, who picked up the thread with practiced ease. "We're concerned about how much you're managing on your own. The house, the finances, the cabin. It's a lot. And," Celeste added, squeezing my hand lightly, "you're not getting any younger. We just want to make sure you're protected, that everything's in place. You know, legally." They didn't say power of attorney, not yet, but the air around the table tensed like a bowstring. "And what would that look like?" I asked, reaching for my coffee as if this were any other conversation. "Well," Brian said, folding his hands, "we were thinking, if you let us take over the management of the cabin, maybe move some of your finances into a shared portfolio, consolidate things. It might ease your burden and protect your legacy." "Connor says," Mira chimed in, catching herself too late. "Connor?" I echoed, my voice steady. Celeste's smile faltered. "He's just someone we've consulted, a financial planner. Young, sharp. He's helped us a lot lately." Interesting, considering Connor was also the one who, as Jacob told me, had been whispering about my underperforming assets and the untapped value of the beach property. Celeste leaned in again, her voice dropping to that patronizing tone I'd come to recognize over the years. The same one she used on customer service reps and teenage baristas. "You don't need to handle everything on your own anymore, Mom. You've done enough. Let us take care of things now, especially that cabin. It's just sitting there, empty most of the year. You know it's worth nearly $500,000. There it was, the real ask, the beach cabin, the heart of Walter's legacy. The place where we watched sunrises wrapped in old quilts and drank wine from chipped mugs while laughing at seagulls fighting over toast crusts. They wanted it. Badly. "It's not about the money," Brian said quickly. "It's about preserving your memory. Mira's even offered to document it, make a family history book, photos, stories, everything." Mira nodded, her face suddenly earnest. "It'd be a tribute, Grandma. Something for future generations." I smiled, a small, quiet smile, because I could see it all now. The performance, the script, the strategy, the wine, the hugs, the nostalgia, all leading up to this carefully staged intervention. And they thought I'd fall for it. I set my coffee cup down and patted Celeste's hand in return. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "Let me give it some thought." The room relaxed an inch. Brian's shoulders loosened. Celeste exhaled like she'd passed the most important test of her life. But they didn't notice the glint in my eye, the way I looked at Mira a moment too long, the way I tucked away their words, not just in memory, but into the file folder already waiting on my desk at home. Because what they didn't know was this. I hadn't come to be convinced. I'd come to listen, to observe, to confirm. And in the next room, behind a slightly ajar door, their whispers would tell me everything I needed to know. After dessert, store-bought tiramisu masquerading as homemade, Celeste insisted I relax in the living room while she and Mira cleared the table. Brian disappeared, claiming he had a quick call to return, though I noticed he took his wine glass with him. I excused myself to use the restroom, taking the long hallway that passed the office instead of the powder room near the kitchen. A deliberate detour. Old homes speak in creaks and soft echoes, and Celeste's house was no different. The office door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch the murmur of voices behind it. I paused. Walter used to say that sometimes you don't need to knock to know you're not welcome. And sometimes you don't need to ask to hear the truth. I stood still. Inside, I heard Brian first. Once she signs, we move fast. That cabin is worth at least $500,000. We can renovate, flip it. Connor says the market's perfect right now. Celeste's voice followed, sharper than it had been at dinner. Honestly, I'm tired of pretending she's competent. This whole act of hers, watering her plants, going to her little book club, she barely tracks conversations. Jacob says she's slipping. My breath caught. Jacob? My Jacob? He's worried, Celeste continued. Says she asked about the same thing twice in one call. I think we should talk to a lawyer. My pulse drummed in my ears, but my fingers stayed steady as I slowly reached into my cardigan pocket, pulling out my phone. I pressed record. I'd been a librarian for 38 years. I knew how to archive things, paper or digital, and I knew that sometimes people's worst truths came out not in what they screamed, but in what they whispered when they thought no one could hear. Brian laughed, short, smug. Connor says we could have her declared unfit. If we document a few signs, missed bills, confused texts, whatever, it could speed up guardianship. Once we have that, we control the trust. Everything. Celeste exhaled sharply. It's sad, but it's for her own good. She clearly can't manage things anymore. She barely knows what day it is half the time. And if she gets upset, we'll say it's memory stress, emotional strain. They were planning to erase me, bit by bit, paper by paper, until I was just a signature and a story they'd tell over cocktails. The woman who used to be sharp, but needed help in the end. They didn't know I'd just passed a full cognitive health exam 6 months ago, or that Farah had me draft independent medical affidavits as a precaution. They didn't know I still did my own taxes, managed my own estate documents, and taught a digital archiving course at the senior center twice a month. They just assumed. Because to them, gray hair equaled incompetence, age equaled absence, and love, apparently, equaled access. I backed away silently, phone recording still active, and stepped into the nearby powder room. I stared at myself in the mirror, my face calm, lips slightly pursed, the faintest tremble under my chin. Not fear, not sadness, clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad day or a poor choice of words. This was betrayal with a plan. When I returned to the living room, I found Mira alone, scrolling on her phone. "Where's your mom?" I asked gently. "Cleaning up," she said without looking up. "She said you might be heading out soon." I nodded. "Yes, I should get going. It gets dark early now." Mira looked up then, her eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something, maybe discomfort, maybe awareness, but not guilt, not yet. Celeste reappeared with a fresh glass of wine and a smile that didn't quite reach her cheeks. "Drive safe, Mom," she said, touching my shoulder. "Let's talk more soon." "Oh, we will," I said softly. I hugged her like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't just heard her plotting to dismantle my life with a smile. I hugged her the way she'd been pretending to hug me for years. And then I left. Out into the cool Santa Fe air, stars winking overhead, the mountains hushed in their ancient stillness. As I walked toward my car, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. I felt every inch of the spine Walter used to tell me was steel underneath all my softness. I slid into the driver's seat, placed my phone gently on the passenger side, and whispered to the night, "Not today, Celeste. Not ever." The eavesdrop had changed everything, but the reckoning? That was just beginning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had already brewed a fresh pot of coffee, reviewed the trust documents twice, and typed a detailed summary of everything I'd heard in Celeste's office the night before. Dates, quotes, tone, even background noise. filed like a catalog entry in my mind and now printed, time-stamped, and signed. I called Farah before 8 a.m. She picked up on the second ring. "Lillian?" she said, voice alert, not surprised. "I had a feeling I'd hear from you this week. I didn't bother with pleasantries. They're making a move, Farah, and it's not subtle anymore." She listened quietly as I told her everything. The dinner, the condescension, the planned power grab, the recorded conversation that confirmed not only manipulation, but intent to declare me mentally incompetent. The betrayal, clinical and calculated. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she exhaled. "Then it's time." We met that same afternoon in her office. Her assistant brought coffee, and Farah already had the Blue Haven Trust file open on her conference table. Next to it sat a second folder with a bold black tab labeled Contingency Protocols. Marlowe. Walter would have approved of the efficiency. "We start with the clause," Farah said, flipping to the page we both knew by heart. Section 9.4. In the event that a named beneficiary demonstrates coercive, hostile, or exploitative behavior toward the grantor, the trust shall reserve the right to revoke disbursement privileges and reclaim any property held in joint title or conditional ownership under its authority. "Is your recording clear?" she asked. I nodded, sliding the USB over. Crystal, their voices, their intent, everything. "Good," she said. "Then we activate the clause." The paperwork was precise and quietly powerful. A single notarized directive allowed the trust to initiate the asset reversal on the house Celeste and Brian believed they owned. Another document revoked Celeste's designation as successor trustee and executor of my will. Both roles she had accepted with smug confidence 3 years ago during one of her rare, generous phases. "I'd like to name Jacob in her place," I said. Farah paused, eyes searching mine. "You're sure?" "He's the only one who told me the truth," I said, "and he asked for nothing in return." Farah gave a small approving nod and jotted down the change. Good instincts. Walter would have liked him. By mid-afternoon, we had also reviewed the updated power of attorney paperwork. Until now, Celeste had been listed as my secondary medical proxy, something I'd done years ago before Brian began digging his claws into her, back when she still laughed like my daughter. That ended now. I want no connection between them and any financial or medical decision-making, I told Farah. None. If they try to touch anything, I want it to burn in their hands. Farah smiled faintly. "You're not angry, you're resolved." "There's a difference," I replied. I signed the new will with a steady hand. It now rerouted a significant portion of my remaining estate, excluding the beach cabin, which had always been set aside, to fund a new initiative I'd been quietly researching for months. A community program for older women facing housing insecurity. Widows, teachers, librarians, women like me. It would be called the Blue Haven Project. Farah leaned back once everything was notarized. "This, Lillian, this is a fortress. You've built yourself a legal wall that no one's getting through." "Good," I said, gathering my coat, "because they're already circling the gates." That evening, I returned home and pulled a box from my closet marked Simply Legacy. Inside were photos, notes from students, Walter's war medals, and the original sketches of the beach cabin he'd drawn in blue ink on grid paper. I set them aside and instead reached for a clean yellow folder. Across the top, I wrote in crisp black ink, "Evidence of exploitation, Marlowe family." Inside, I filed the recording transcript, a printout of Jacob's text, copies of Celeste's messages about dinner, and a backup of every trust transfer I'd made since 2018. I left a post-it on the first page. "If something happens to me, Farah has the originals." Then I walked to the garden, sat on the bench under the apricot tree, and watched the breeze pull loose petals into the air. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer standing in the shadows of my own life. The line had been drawn, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in protection. For myself, for Walter's legacy, and for every woman who'd ever been told she was only valuable when she gave. Celeste would learn soon enough. This librarian knows exactly how to organize a reckoning. The payment was due on a Monday. They didn't know it yet, but I'd already pulled the trust's monthly transfer on Thursday evening, quietly, deliberately, after I triple-checked the timing and the clause that allowed me to do so. Farah had already confirmed it in writing. If Celeste and Brian's partial contribution failed to meet the mortgage requirement by close of business Monday, the trust would initiate the transfer of ownership back to its control. And I had no intention of covering the difference. By Monday morning, the panic had started. At 9:17 a.m., my phone rang. Celeste. I didn't answer. At 9:32 a.m., a text arrived. Mom, something weird just happened. The mortgage payment didn't go through. Did you forget to send the check from the trust? Call me. I didn't reply. I let her sit in it. By noon, the second message was less measured. There's an issue with the house account. Brian's furious. Please call me. At 1:04 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, Brian. I declined the call and opened the window of my sunroom instead, letting the autumn air roll in. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately. And then, at 1:18 p.m., Celeste tried again, this time with brittle concern. Mom, please. The payment bounced and we got a warning email from a company called Blue Haven Holdings LLC. Who are they? This makes no sense. We've always paid the $1,250 and now it says that's insufficient? You need to call them right away. We're getting default notices. Something is very wrong. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and dialed. She answered before the first ring finished. Mom, thank God. You saw my messages? I did, I said calmly. What's happening? They're saying we didn't pay enough, that the total is $4,250. That's never been the amount. I let her flail for a moment, let her wear herself down. Then I said softly, Celeste, Blue Haven Holdings is the trust, the one your father and I created. Silence. What? She whispered. I've been making up the difference, I said. For 5 years, quietly, every month, because I knew you and Brian couldn't afford the house on your own. More silence. Then, Mom, that's not possible. Brian thought, our mortgage was with Santa Fe first. No, I replied. It was, until the trust bought it. That's what trusts are for, to protect people who can't manage on their own. Her breathing quickened on the other end of the line. But why wouldn't you tell us? Because I didn't want to shame you, I said. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I carried the burden quietly, you'd find your footing. And maybe you'd appreciate that help someday. She went quiet again, but I wasn't done. I know about the conversation, Celeste. The one you and Brian had in the office. I heard everything. I recorded it. Wait, what are you? I know about the plan to push guardianship, to get me declared incompetent, to force the sale of the beach cabin. I know about Connor, about the fake concern, the script, the performance. Her voice cracked. Mom, you misunderstood. That was just talk. We were worried. You've been forgetful. No, I said. You were greedy. You saw an aging woman and assumed that meant weakness. You forgot I spent nearly 4 decades running a public library and managing $100,000 budgets before Google even existed. I track better than you ever have. There was a long silence. I imagined her sitting in their over-furnished living room, staring at the walls I helped keep standing, realizing they weren't hers anymore. Brian's voice erupted in the background. Is she admitting she stopped the payment? That's fraud. That's illegal. No, I said, raising my voice slightly so he'd hear. That's clause 9.4 of the trust you never bothered to read. And I didn't stop anything. I simply stopped contributing. Which means your partial payment triggered the default clause. The property is now in legal transition back to the trust. Celeste's voice dropped to a whimper. You can't do this, Mom. Where are we supposed to go? What about Mira? What are people going to say? I stood then walking toward the cabinet where I kept the file. I opened it and glanced at the notarized documents, the signatures, the cold black ink of a woman finally drawing her line. They'll say the truth, I replied, that a mother gave until there was nothing left but silence, that she kept your house afloat for 5 years while being called a burden behind her back, that she finally stopped. Brian cut in again. "We'll sue. You've ruined us." I smiled, even though no one could see it. "You can try," I said, "but I've documented everything. Call Farah if you need a copy of the ledger, or the transcript." Celeste made a sound then, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "I never meant," she began. "Yes," I said, "you did." I ended the call. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in my garden, the branches swaying like they knew what I'd done. I poured myself another cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the shadows grow longer across the grass. It was done. The mask had dropped. The payment had passed. And for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't the one carrying their weight. They had called me a burden. Now they would learn what it felt like to be dropped. It took 3 weeks for the legal transition to complete. 3 quiet, deliberate weeks. 3 weeks of voicemails left unanswered, emails ignored, and missed calls piling up like old junk mail, each one tinged with increasing desperation. I saved them all. Not because I planned to respond, but because I wanted to remember how quickly fear replaced entitlement. The foreclosure proceedings were clean. Farah made sure of that. The trust didn't need permission to reclaim what it already owned. Only confirmation of default, which came the moment Celeste and Brian's $1,250 failed to meet the monthly minimum. No more grace periods, no more silent subsidies, no more giving without boundaries. And so, on a clear Thursday morning, a quiet knock came at their door. Not from me, but from the courier Farah had arranged. In his hands, a packet of legal documents, a letter of final notification, and the trust's formal notice of possession. By sundown, the house was no longer theirs. They hadn't been evicted, not in the traditional sense. There were no sheriffs, no courtroom drama, but the result was the same. Celeste called once more that night. I didn't pick up. I simply watched the phone ring in the same reading nook where I'd first watched the video Jacob sent. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. They moved out 2 weeks later, quietly in the early morning. Jacob told me they rented a small apartment in Rio Rancho. No porch swing, no built-in bookshelves, no oversized kitchen island where Celeste could host her wine nights. Just a modest 2-bedroom with a view of a parking lot. A home they could actually afford. They left behind a mess. The landscaping had gone wild. The pantry was half-stocked with expired spices. The master bath had a crack in the tile that someone had covered with duct tape instead of fixing. I stood in the center of the empty living room the day the keys were returned, the sunlight angling through the windows in long gold lines. I thought I'd feel anger, bitterness maybe, but I didn't. I felt peace. I felt space. And I felt the memory of Walter beside me, his hand on my back, his steady voice saying, "We built this to hold something real." I didn't keep the house for myself. I could have. I thought about it briefly. The large windows, the quiet street, the memories that could have been rewritten with new beginnings, but I'd already made my decision. The Blue Haven Literacy and Life Skills Center for Women opened 5 months later. We held the first workshop in the very same kitchen where Brian once mocked my reading habits. There, over cups of coffee and handouts printed on recycled paper, we taught budgeting, resume writing, computer literacy, not to teenagers, but to women like me. Women who had been told their value declined with age. Women who had been invisible in their own families. We converted the guest bedroom into a small reading lounge, the office into a counseling space. The backyard became a modest community garden. The laundry room, yes, even that, held a resource board with sticky notes offering shared rides, elder care contacts, and donation drives. The house had once held whispers of manipulation. Now it hummed with purpose. Word spread quickly. Retired teachers, divorced grandmothers, women who had raised children only to be sidelined in their own stories. They came, shy at first, then bold with belonging. And me? I didn't just direct the program, I lived it. The house wasn't a relic anymore. It was a reclaimed space, a shelter made sacred by transformation. As for Mira, she never reached out. Not after the unraveling. Jacob told me she was ashamed, angry, confused. I didn't push. Some bridges take time to rebuild. Some never do. But Jacob, he came often, helped paint the walls, built new bookshelves, sat beside me as we named each room in honor of the women who'd made a difference in our lives. The reading room was named after Walter, the entryway after my mother, who never finished high school but made sure I did. The sunroom? We named it Marlowe Hall, Jacob's idea. I want people to know this place stands because you didn't give up, he said. One night, after the last group left, I stood in that room with the lights dimmed low, a mug of peppermint tea in my hand, and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not satisfaction, not victory, but presence. The kind that fills your bones when you know you've stepped fully into your own life again. The kind that lets you sleep with the windows open. The kind that says, this is your home now, not because you paid for it, but because you reclaimed it, room by room, word by word, step by steady, resolute step. I moved to the beach cabin in Rockport on a Wednesday. No fanfare, no send-off, just me, my books, a few boxes of photos, and the cat Jacob rescued from a storm drain 2 summers ago. The ocean was just as Walter had left it, untamed, patient, indifferent to human schemes. The waves lapped at the shore like they'd always done, pulling away whatever didn't belong. The porch still creaked in the same spot where he used to set his fishing boots. His hat still hung on the hook by the door. And the sky, Lord, that sky, was as wide and forgiving as I remembered it. But I wasn't here to grieve. I was here to begin. The first few days were slow and strange. I unpacked deliberately, letting each item find its rightful place. I framed the new version of my will and tucked it in the cabinet above the pantry. I hung a corkboard by the kitchen window with my calendar, my grocery list, and a few photos Jacob had printed for me. One of Walter and me in our 30s, sunburned and grinning. One of me and Jacob at the dedication of Marlowe Hall, and one of the cabin from the dock at sunset. I applied to volunteer at the Rockport Library the same week I moved in. They offered me a part-time position on the spot, Saturday mornings at the reference desk and Tuesday evenings for their over 70 book circle. On my first shift, a little girl asked me where the dragons lived in the library. I told her, top shelf back corner where only the brave can reach. She beamed. I saw something in her expression I hadn't felt in years. Trust. That simple, open-hearted belief that older women still hold magic. I joined a hiking group the following month. All women over 70, some divorced, some widowed, some gloriously single. They walked like their knees never hurt, laughed like they had nothing left to prove, and talked about everything, from knee replacements to Catherine Mansfield, with irreverent delight. They didn't ask what I used to be. They asked who I was now. Jacob visited often. He'd drive down from Santa Fe on long weekends, always bringing fresh bread from his co-op and some odd artifact he thought I'd like, a wooden compass, a stone shaped like a feather, once even a vintage library stamp he found at a flea market. We'd sit on the porch, drinking tea, watching the tide roll in. "This place suits you, Grandma," he said one evening, his voice low as the sun sank into the sea. "I think it always did," I replied. "I just wasn't ready to live in it yet. Sometimes we read poetry. Sometimes we just listen to the waves." He never asked about his parents again, and I never brought them up. I didn't need to. Their silence was its own kind of answer. Mira sent a card once, no return address. Just a simple, handwritten line inside. "I'm sorry." I didn't see it clearly until it was too late. I didn't know what to feel. Regret, maybe. But not bitterness. People don't always become their worst selves because they're evil. Sometimes they just follow the easiest path, the one paved with excuses and unchecked entitlement. But that didn't make me responsible for walking it with them. No, the path I chose now curved with salt air and morning light, and the laughter of women who had stopped apologizing for their wisdom. My days were mine, my choices were mine, and I wasn't living out of spite. I was living out of reclamation. I watered my garden every morning, rosemary and sage growing in thick, fragrant clusters. I cooked slowly. I wore linen even when I wasn't going anywhere. I sent postcards to Jacob with quotes from Adrienne Rich, Mary Oliver, and sometimes just simple messages like, "Today the tide came in, and so did I." I smiled more, slept deeply. dreamt without dread. Because now, finally, I lived in a space that didn't measure my worth by what I could give away, but by what I chose to keep. And every time I turned the key in the door of that cabin, I was reminded of the most radical act I'd ever committed: choosing myself. Fully, finally, without permission. All my life, I thought helping meant silence. I thought love was best expressed in sacrifice, the quiet kind, the kind you don't ask credit for. I thought the weight of family was something you carried no matter how heavy it became, no matter how little your own hands were held in return. I thought being needed was the same as being valued. But standing here now, barefoot in my garden with the scent of rosemary rising around me and the ocean breeze threading through my hair, I know better. Love, real love, is not the absence of boundaries. It is the presence of dignity. It took me 77 years to draw that line, not with anger, but with clarity. Not to punish, but to protect. I used to believe that staying silent was noble, that letting things slide meant peace. But silence without acknowledgement isn't peace, it's erasure. And I was never meant to be invisible in my own life. The cabin stands just as Walter and I dreamed it would. Wind-worn, sunlit, humble. The boards creak when the tide pulls close, and sometimes I swear I hear his voice in the pine trees behind the house, telling me he knew I'd find my way here. The Blue Haven Literacy Center still sends me their monthly newsletters. I read them with pride, smiling at the photos of women standing in rooms I once paid for with years of silence. Now, those rooms are filled with laughter, learning, and second chances. Jacob visits whenever he can. We don't talk much about the past anymore. We don't need to. We've built something new, an honesty that doesn't require translation. Last week, he brought his fiancée, a kind-eyed girl named Elise who asked thoughtful questions and offered to help with the dishes. She took a photo of me on the porch, sunlight in my hair, a book in my lap, a mug of tea beside me. She called it unapologetically sovereign. I think Walter would have liked that. Mira wrote again, a longer letter this time, no demands, no excuses, just a story, about the time I taught her to write her name in cursive on the back of a library card, and how she never forgot how proud I looked. Maybe someday we'll find our way back to one another. Or maybe not. But either way, I am whole, because I've stopped measuring my worth by how much I'm willing to lose. Now I measure it by how fully I live. I teach. I hike. I read until my eyes blur and cook until the herbs run dry. I water my garden like it's a promise to the future. And every evening as the wind moves through the eucalyptus and the waves kiss the shore below, I sit on the porch, close my eyes and smile, not bitter, not regretful, but finally unburdened. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't what you give. It's the moment you decide to give back to yourself.